Hitachi Energy is proud to partner with the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Powering Purpose is a new book resulting from the partnership between Hitachi Energy and Monocle. It tells the story of the people and the technology leading the energy transition and ushering in a sustainable and secure future. Hitachi Energy and Monocle work together to provide inspiration on powering people's lives and where to find the energy for change in the era of electrification. Secure your copy now at monocle.com or in store in Monocle outlets around the world. And if you want to understand the role you can play in harnessing connections to ensure a brighter, more sustainable and secure future, head to hitachienergy.com. Hitachi Energy and Monocle, inspiring the energy for change.
If one is looking for a parable for the potential perils of a swiftly changing environment, it is hard to improve on a big room full of dinosaur skeletons. In November, at the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences in Brussels, the Foreign Desk launched its new partnership with Hitachi Energy, with a special live panel discussion about the challenges and the tremendous opportunities of the planet's transition to cleaner energy. The location was significant for a more contemporary reason. Brussels is where many of the decisions will be taken that could either hasten this necessary revolution or impede it. And if Europe more broadly should have learnt something from the last 3.5 years in particular, it is the lesson that fossil fuels are a political and diplomatic dead end as well as an environmental one. What are the priorities in enabling the energy transition? Can we hope it makes energy more affordable as well as cleaner? And how important is it that the corporations pursuing these aims collaborate as well as compete? This is the Foreign Desk. I will now introduce the panel. They are Christian Ohle, who is Head of Global Product Group Switchgear at Hitachi Energy, Vera Silva, Chief Strategy and Technology Officer, General Electric Vernova Electrification Systems, Frederick Bielitz, Head of Advisory Central Europe, Aurora Energy Research. I'll start with you, Frederick, over there on the end. How would you basically explain your job beyond the impressive sounding title I've just read out?
Let me just very briefly say a few words about Aurora Energy Research. So we essentially are an energy market and energy data analytics company. We want to create the platform, the data analytics platform for the energy transition. So we have software applications that help understand energy and electricity markets. And we basically want to attract as much private investment, as much private capital into the energy transition. That's really our motto. And I head the advisory team. That means I work with our clients on asset-specific or investment-specific questions, be that particular transactions, be that investment strategies, be that thinking about what portfolio should they pursue on renewables or on different markets that they're involved in.
Vera, what would your answer to the same question be? How would you briefly sum up what your day-to-day role involves?
Basically, I'll just start explaining a little bit what Vernova Electrification Systems does, for those who don't know. So Hitachi Energy is our mighty competitor. And so we cover all the different technologies for grid, power conversion and storage. That's very much the span of the activity globally. And I lead the strategy team, so very much about what are the trends, where is the business going, how do we allocate capital. I lead the technology, so very traditional R&D leader, and hence I dedicate a lot of time when we need to have a technology breakthrough or a change, and how do we do it alone, in partnership, when do we need to collaborate. And I have a third hat, which is Chief Commercial Officer, which really allows me to be very close to global customers and understand the chain from capital allocation strategy, new technology, as well as how this goes into the customer. So that's very much where I spend my time.
And Christian?
Yes, I'm heading the product group Switchgear, and this gives me the opportunity to explain what switchgear is.
Oh, please. Spared me having to ask. Thank you.
Most people don't know it, and for a good reason, because our electricity is on all the time and people don't think of it. But how can it be on all the time? Because the grid is a grid. That means that electricity can always have many ways to come from one point to the next point. And grid means there are nodes where these things intersect. And at this node is the important stuff. There are the substation of the grid. And the substation has two important things. The one is the transformer that's kind of transporting the current from the different voltage level. And the other one is the switchgear, which redirect the current in case something is faulty or something doesn't work. And I'm heading switchgear for one of the big global companies doing this stuff.
Well, there's a couple of big global companies represented here, obviously. And Vera, I will put this one to you because Tom and Andreas were talking earlier about the value of collaboration, and it might come as a surprise to people from outside your industry to see these two representatives of great corporate rivals sitting next to each other and so far at least apparently getting on quite well. So my question is, where is the balance between collaboration and competition in exactly that relationship between Hitachi and GE? What are you not telling them, basically?
So maybe I go back to the specific nature of grid. I think Andreas touched about it before, which is the grid is actually an interconnected system across borders, even interconnected through continents, that requires in many cases that we have standard products that are going to behave a certain way because it is a critical infrastructure that is not done in islands or slots. So the first thing is there's always a collaboration in standardizing and defining the technical performances, and there's institutions for that. So you need to do that from engineering perspective. Then there's the aspect of the supply chain, which is these are very high capex elements and long lead times. So customers need to make sure there's a diverse supply chain where they can rely on finding these standard solutions across different players. So that is the second aspect of industry. That means that somehow we invent a product, but often you need to have at least another player that's going to provide a similar product because this is a very regulated business. So that drives a certain level of collaboration across the industry since the grid exists more than 100 years. And when it comes to bringing new technology, that collaboration becomes even more important because at some point the customer will want to have something they can manage where some of the aspects are comparable. And this is where some years ago, this first discussion I had with Christian about bringing something really new, these SF6 alternatives to the grid, but we were asked even by the industry itself to say the same way we standardized something 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we need the industry to bring us again products that can scale and that we can acquire broadly. And this is why often these collaborations come naturally, done obviously with a lot of structure around them, but very fruitful, like the collaboration with Christian already for more than 5 years.
I'll put a variant on the question to you, Christian, because what you're talking about sounds to me a lot like what various military types I've interviewed in the last 3 years especially call interoperability, and that is trying to standardize various munitions and equipment so you don't have the spectacle of a Ukrainian gunner trying to shove an Italian shell into a Danish cannon and wondering why nothing comes out the other end. But in that particular instance of replacement of sulfur hexafluoride, did you know they used to use it to fill tennis balls?
Yes.
I thought you probably would, but that to me was quite an exciting fact. But in that specific instance, how does that relationship actually work? If either, say, Hitachi or GE thinks they've come up with something, what do you actually tell your competitor? And do you have any worries at all about protecting your own proprietary technology? Or is this just a thing where you realize, no, everybody needs to know this?
Let me put this right. I mean, it's a very distant kind of relationship. But let me start, because I think many in the public will not understand why SF6 has been in tennis balls and is in switchgear. Obviously, electrical grid are a solution to climate change. Everything needs to become electric. Many people know this. But also, equipment in the power grid is unfortunately also contributing to adverse climate change by using this famous gas, SF6, sulfur hexafluoride, because it's technically so superior that it allows us to make all the equipment super compact. And of course, everybody wants compact equipment. Now, since a while, I think probably 2 decades at least, our industry is pretty clear, all our customers and the vendors, that we need to phase out SF6 because it's not the sustainable way to build this equipment. And a couple of years ago, the pressure was mounting. The industry said every vendor is developing something different instead of this SF6. And this is simply too chaotic. And at this point, we negotiated something where the two companies give patent right to what each other had done. So it was kind of a cross-patent agreement. And this enabled both companies to advance much faster in the development of this technology. And also, at the same time, we invited others to use the same technology. So we wanted to create a common understanding how to get rid of SF6 and how to replace SF6. But this is, as I said, a very distant relationship. It only goes so far that we say, you can use our patents and we can use your patent. So it was a simple setup, but it really enabled the technology to become what it is today, the mainstream replacement for this sulfur hexafluoride.
Frederick, to bring you back in, from your vantage point, is this kind of collaboration between apparent rivals, is that becoming more the norm than the exception in energy in particular, because people realize for obvious reasons that they do need to collaborate because they do need to all be able to work to some level on the same infrastructure?
Yes and no, I would say. I mean, I think, of course, one asset class that is currently, very, very hot and plays an absolute critical part in the energy transition are batteries and storage. And there, actually, we see quite a lot of competition. Yeah, there might be a little bit of sharing of knowledge, but there is quite a lot of competition. I think, of course, in this example, this is a regulated industry. It's a network. So their collaboration tends to potentially be more common. But what I would say, actually, what is really interesting to see is that I think we're seeing a lot of cross-collaboration among policymakers, regulators, and TSOs and system operators. I think much more so than before. So the regulatory approach, I would say, of kind of principal agent model, I tell you what you have to do, I think that's long gone, right? I think we now have a much more collaborative approach across those different entities with the same objective. How can we reach the energy transition? And that's really interesting to see, because you see not only that between the players that would compete normally, but between, let's say, the entities and the agents that might actually typically be adversarial in that sense. So that's a very positive trend, I think, because at the end of the day, I think everybody realizes that this common goal requires quite a lot of close collaboration.
Vera, Frederick there uses the phrase the energy transition, which I guess is the uniting theme of this conversation. When you work in the industry which is supposed to be bringing that about, do you think of it as an actual end point, or is it just this ceaseless work in progress, trying to make things slightly incrementally better as you go along?
I think as we look at it, it is a process, because there's different rhythms and different building blocks of the energy system we're transforming at different stages. So what is happening today in Europe, or even which parts of industry are changing, is going to be a slightly different pace that we might find in other geographies, while the end game is still to continuously improving and reducing the impact in the climate change. So there was a first stage that was very clear, at least in Europe, about decarbonizing power generation, very much built on increasing renewables. There's nuclear generation back to the table. How do we decarbonize generation? And then electrify. But electrifying is actually putting a lot of tension to the grid. We're pushing both extremes of the grid and not really investing in the grid for about 2 decades so far. So I can see this is very much the age of grid expansion and modernization. That's why the debate today is so important, which is which technology are we bringing to this grid that became now the most pressing issue of succeeding this transition. And what I can see is that perhaps there will be geographies, and I have to mention the US, where the decarbonization of the generation might have been less of a priority. Electrification is in full bloom, which means the grid is still front and center of this transition. So I would say that it's going to be a process. And for me, what's really important in the short term is to make sure that we focus on the grid and that we develop these grids. Otherwise, it will become a bottleneck to both decarbonizing generation as well as electrification.
And Christian, a variation on that question. How hard is it, though, to maintain any kind of course when you're not sure or it's unknowable what other technologies may emerge? Is it tough to commit to one particular course of action knowing that there might be some other unforeseen upheaval?
compared to other industry, I think the power grid industry is fairly predictable. I mean, grids have been around since 1880, and then they have organically increased in complexity and in power. And the technology are defined by energy consideration. And so technology tends not to change extremely suddenly. Of course, the advent of the data center is a kind of a special load, more or less, that people didn't have on their planning screens. But otherwise, in our industry, technology like a transformer, overhead lines, switchgear tend to be fairly, let's say, slowly moving. There are also examples like in HVDC technology, where really with a special technology, very long distance transmission is made. HVDC stands for high voltage direct current, in contrast to the AC alternating current. So there are a few special applications where technology has a sudden or more surprising impact, but most of the grid development has to do with long-term planning and public money and really some long-term vision.
Amid all that volatility, and I'll put this to you, Frederick, there is the fact that, well, nobody really wants this from anything, but something people really don't want from an energy grid or energy systems is unreliability. What do you see as the challenges of avoiding that while this period of transition and adaptation goes on? Again, Tom and Andreas mentioning earlier that we have learnt in recent years that it's quite possible for most of a large European country to have all its lights go off, which is obviously not ideal.
Not ideal is an understatement. So, of course, it's essential, of course. And I think it's worth actually also looking at some numbers or considering some numbers. Actually, Aurora will publish a report next month about the required investments in grids in Europe. And we keep talking about it being a bottleneck and being a constraint. This has, of course, a security of supply element to it that you mentioned, but it's also a question of affordability, right? I mean, if we all look at our electricity bills right now, we see the chunk of network costs becoming larger and larger and larger, but also because we're wasting a lot of our energy, unfortunately, our renewable energy, because we have grid constraints, right? I mean, there's actually the amount of green electrons that can go into the network is increasing, of course, but it is constrained because the networks aren't there. So there's a real requirement to increase investments into the network to make sure that those lower cost green electrons make it to the consumer and help generate an affordable energy transition. And this is, by the way, for high voltage, but also, of course, for the distribution networks as well. As we're moving from a, let's say, centralized thermal power system to a more decentralized green power system, networks are the arteries of this whole body that exists. And we're currently seeing that the investments in both of those types of networks are of the order of magnitude of 60 billion euros per year in Europe. They need to be anywhere between 80 and 120 billion euros per year, just to give you an order of magnitude, right? Because we are also assuming, if we want to reach our net zero targets, a doubling of electricity demand over the next 25 years. That requires a major investment in order to make that happen. And that doubling of electricity demand is electrification of industry, data centers, hydrogen production, electric mobility. So that will come, and that necessitates a major investment in networks. Now, of course, the question is, will the major investments in networks not actually mean higher bills? Well, if we can make sure that this electrification happens, we will have a larger number of kilowatt hours and megawatt hours over which to distribute those investments in. So as demand increases, the per unit costs of each of those electrons will reduce. But we can only get there if we create the backbone and if we create the investment in the grid that is needed.
Vera, I see you nodding there. It is, again, I speak as somebody who, and I'm sure many share the experience, has recently looked at their electricity bill and sort of shrieked. Is the ultimate endpoint of this electricity, which is not merely greener and more reliable, but actually cheaper?
It's a tough question you're asking me. I nodded because I think that there is a stage in which we need to accept that the part of the electricity that will concern the backbone infrastructure will have to increase. So this hard to explain grid tariff piece needs to be well understood, because that is the way to make sure we will be able to generate from the lower cost generation. Today, congestion costs in Germany, in Europe, are extremely high, and this is the difference between what we would have paid by cheaper electricity that gets curtailed, and then we will use more expensive electricity. So I would say at the moment we are in one of the worst pieces. The aim obviously is affordability, and the question is that in this transition stage the affordability isn't visible yet, and a piece of the infrastructure cost becomes more visible in the tariffs, which is raising a lot of a complex debate. But ultimately, if we have the right infrastructure and if we can really evacuate this lower cost electricity, we should reach a more affordable electricity price.
Which, Christian, you would hope is something that governments have a vested interest in, because certainly, well, any government that wants to get re-elected doesn't want its voters' bills to keep going up. So, yeah, they do have an interest in this. But with that in mind, are there, as a general rule, things that governments could be doing more of, or perhaps such is the way of governments, less of, which would help this process get to where it needs to go?
I mean, being here in Brussels, I tell maybe a little bit my own experience with politics. I was in technology and in business for all my career until this story developed about phasing out SF6, sulfur hexafluoride. And that's the first time I got into contact with policymakers and also understood how difficult policy making is. Because here in Brussels, we have this ambitious Green Deal that wants really to push all our economy into a more sustainable. But the one big challenge is to make those rules while pushing, in our case, to SF6 free, to make them technology neutral. And so that the free competition between companies like GE Vernova and Hitachi Energy can work in a framework of rules that are neutral regarding what the solution eventually will be. And this applies also very much to all the power equipment. Like, I think policy need to set rules that allow all the vendors to create their best solutions to fulfill this mission and this vision.
Frederick, has it been your experience so far that governments more or less do actually understand all this at this point, or are some doing it better than others?
There are certainly best practices that one can copy from one country to another, but it's also a journey, right? So, if you think about some of the German policies in the early 90s about supporting renewables, they seem outdated now, but because of the cost changes, the technological changes as well. So there are different trajectories that different governments are on. But I think overall, at a European scale at least, I think all the governments are on board and I think they understand how to get there. The question is, are they willing to make the political sacrifice to a certain extent also to implement these changes? But the realization of action is certainly there. I think the political will is a different question, right? And I think that's something that we're seeing probably changing a little bit right now, but the general sense of direction, I think, is still very much there.
Let me jump on this because you're based in London, no?
I am.
In the UK, all new switchgear equipment is free of SF6 with very simple form of driving this process. Here in the European Union, there is a very complicated set of rules, and it's in fact, regarding the environmental goals, is behind the UK for this particular topic of making equipment free of SF6.
We are extraordinarily already coming towards the end of our time. I wanted to conclude by going a bit back to where we came in, which was, I started by asking the three of you what basically you do all day. And I want to finish by asking you each in turn, and I'll start with you, Christian, because you're closer to me, what you're maybe going to do next week, if you like. Like, what is a particular thing you're working on right now that you're really excited about in the context of what we've been discussing?
My main occupation, including next week, is still to make this transition complete. So to have all available equipment that exists in the traditional technology to make it available in the new technology. And this is a long journey to achieve. Yeah.
Vera?
I was going through my agenda for next week to be very pragmatic. So there's really two things which will matter to me next week. The first one is very much to continue this journey that Christian mentioned about making sure that the points of what we're doing and why it is important to have roles that are technology agnostic and are really driving what is the best life cycle assessment as a technology, making sure the advocacy remains at the key of my team. And the second one is bringing some of this message to the segment where I spend most of my time, which is data centers and AI, and trying to make sure that when we bring a technology to the table, that we give all of these options also to these new types of customers.
And Frederick, and finally, and no pressure, bearing in mind that the Foreign Desk generally tries to take, if not necessarily a positive view of the subject at hand, and at least a constructive one, looking at what is being done, who is doing it, and what more can be done. What's most exciting you at the moment, or what are you most looking forward to getting into when you get back to the office?
Oh, when I go back to the office. I thought you meant generally the energy transition. I was going to take a step back.
Either or both is good.
Because I think one of the questions that you shared initially was, where will we be in 50 years? And I thought that was a brilliant question. And the way I thought about this, so it's not quite next week, it's in 50 years. But I mean, if you think about where we were 50 years ago, right? If we think about energy where we were 50 years ago, and I mean, I have to say this is before my time, so I had to Google a little bit, but this was, just the advent of nuclear energy. It was a power system that was almost wholly dependent on coal. There weren't hardly computers really around. So I think the next 50 years are going to be such a step change in terms of electrification of all things. I think we will be living in a very electrified world, which we probably cannot really comprehend at this stage, namely both the real world, but also probably some virtual world that we will be living in. And I truly believe that the majority of that electricity will be decarbonized. If you look at the cost curves, so what we call cost curves is basically the cost developments of decarbonized technologies or any technologies. If you look at how steep they have declined for solar, for wind, now for batteries, so storage, for EVs, all those technologies, I think we will see a major, major cost reduction across all of those over the next, well, not even decades, over the next 5 years, I should say, 5 to 10 years. And that's what's really exciting, I think, about generally, not next week, but, the work that we do, that there are so many positive developments there. And I know that we keep saying, politics are a little bit in the way and, there's hiccups, etc. Well, I mean, that's democracy, right? I mean, it's messy, yeah? We have to accept it. We don't live in a planned economy where somebody says this is how it's going to be in the next 10 years. No, we live in a liberal market economy where things move up and down and we move in cycles. And I think we have to embrace that and accept that. And if we take all the positives that we've seen over the last 10, 15, 20 years in the energy transition, I really think we should be much more confident about the next 20 years.
This special episode of The Foreign Desk was recorded on November 18th, 2025 at the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences in Brussels in partnership with Hitachi Energy. For more episodes of The Foreign Desk, go to monocle.com/radio and look out for the new book Powering Purpose, a collaboration between Monocle and Hitachi Energy, available at monocle.com/shop. I'm Andrew Mueller. Thanks for listening.